great to meet you. And I would love to begin our conversation before we get into your work by asking 4 years ago, we were really wrapping our heads around this pandemic and what was going to happen and how long it was going to go, which none of us would know. So ultimately, now at this point, how did you make it through it and how did it change you?
Ooh, interesting question.
Yeah.
So for me, I had an interesting experience because I was trained in EFT tapping, which I know we're going to talk about today,
Yeah.
back in 2014. And at that time, the whole idea of sort of mind body work in psychology was still pretty new. Not a lot of people knew about it. And so everybody who trained me who was doing EFT tapping at that point was already on Zoom.
Yeah.
And that was partly because we were working with clients all over the country. It wasn't super well known, so you kind of had to have a broad reach. So I started seeing clients on Zoom back then.
Okay.
And, I kind of sometimes would joke, my boys would play a lot of video games on their headsets with their friends pre-pandemic. So actually, when the pandemic hit, life didn't change that much for us. I was already working from home
Uh-huh.
on Zoom. My kids already kind of had this. So we were definitely some of the lucky ones
Yeah.
to have gotten through it in a way that was not a huge change. Of course, it
Yeah.
was jarring. And of course, looking back, I think my kids were in junior high and high school, and that really shaped their experience in some really significant ways that, I don't even know if we can fully understand, but it definitely is something that when they get older and when they look back, they're going to have a really different experience that they went through than
Yeah.
most most other teenagers.
Well, and I had teenagers too, and that's the weird thing. Like we've lived this whole life and didn't have that experience of going through a global event that required masks and all these divisions of things happening. It was just this was all brand new to us, but for them, it became more of a part of their lives.
Yeah.
Like I think about like even kids that were kindergartners at the time, they could have thought that was going to be the rest of their lives. They,
Right,
they
right.
didn't know
No,
any different, you
totally.
know?
Yeah, they had no idea. No, I actually feel really lucky to not just that it didn't really change too much of our day to day, but also just the ages they were.
Yeah.
I really felt for people with younger kids. I think that would have been so much harder. And I do remember asking my son about it, who basically missed, his seventh and a good chunk of his eighth grade year. And I said to him, how you doing with all this? This has got to be hard going through all this. And he just looked at me and he said, Mom, how many movies and TV shows have there been made about how bad middle school sucks? I'm like, a lot. He's like, yeah, and I'm missing all of mine. I was
There you
like,
go.
well, that's a way to bright side this
That's that's
situation.
the way to go about it right there. Because I kept thinking that too. Like anytime people complain about middle school in any capacity, I'm like, just think about it. It's middle school, you know?
Yeah.
It's the
Yeah.
time where everybody's changing. It's awkward. It's weird. It
Right.
permeates everything that's in that building. So
Right.
that's just the way it is. So
Yeah.
I'm curious. So you had mentioned EFT, being an EFT practitioner. You're a psychotherapist. You're an author. You got all these things going on. But if I was to put you in front of a group of third graders at career day, and one of the kids said, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" How would you get to the essence and answer that?
Basically, what I would say to that is that I help people manage their big feelings
Yeah.
and make them smaller so that they
Okay.
can feel better day in and day out.
Okay, that's good. So what did you want to be in the third grade? What was your dream to grow up and become?
Actually, my dream was to grow up and become an archaeologist
Okay.
for the longest time until I
Yeah.
figured out I really hate bugs, and that would probably require.
Yeah. A lot of bugs.
So yeah, yeah. I just
Yeah.
don't know where that came from. I don't know if it was like an Indiana Jones thing or what, but yeah, I
Yeah.
for a long
Well,
time.
pop culture is weird like that. I remember I wanted to be a part of the California Highway Patrol. I wanted to be with Poncho on the bike riding around. And then I saw cops when I was a teenager and I was like, yeah, I don't know. When I saw how it really panned out, I was like, I'm good. I'm all right. You know? So
Yeah.
um so take me back to where you were born and raised and how these seeds of getting into a pretty heavy field, helping people, how did all of this evolve into who you are today?
So I grew up in northern New Jersey, outside of New York City. My dad worked in the city, and my grandparents lived on Long Island. And looking back on it, my grandparents had fostered over 50 foster children in their
Wow.
lifetime. Yeah. And foster care was a little bit different back then. It was a lot of times they would foster kids because their mother was in the hospital and the father was still sort of working. And there wasn't an expectation in the 50s that the father would work and take care of the kids. So they would put the kids in this temporary foster situation, maybe just
Wow.
for a few months, something like that. They would live with my grandparents, and then when the mother got well again, they would go back home. And
Wow.
yeah, so that was really common. And then as time went on, it got to be a little bit more traditional foster care. And they one of the kids they had was became available for adoption, and they tried to adopt him, but they weren't able to because he was from a Catholic family and they were Episcopalian,
Ah,
which in today's society, I think most people say those are pretty much the same thing.
yeah.
But back then, it
Uh-huh.
was the judge just said, no, they can't adopt this kid. So just, I grew up with all these stories, and then they did adopt my aunt out of foster care. And I grew up with values around really, reaching out, reaching across the aisle, helping people
Hmm.
who need a leg up. Also, I do think this influenced me greatly. My dad ended up getting drafted into Vietnam, and he did come back with some post traumatic stress from that experience. He was a medic over there. And so I actually went to college thinking I wanted to be a teacher. I loved kids, I love working with kids. And then when I got there, I took a sociology 101 class, and I just kind of fell in love with it. I think the values of just, equality and helping the downtrodden and that kind of thing was just values that came from my family anyway. So I
Yeah.
really related to that. I had an amazing professor, and I ended up switching and going into, I double majored in psychology and social work in college and went out into the field. And then I sort of narrowed in, and my expertise was on working with trauma victims, foster children in the inner city of Chicago. And I did that for almost 20 years before I've sort of moved into my current phase of my career.
Interesting. Yeah, my dad was born in Brooklyn and raised in Long Island.
Mm,
And he joined the Air Force and got stationed here in Kansas City. But all he ever talked about wanting to do was go to active combat. And he
mm,
talked to me about how they used to have lights on the wall that would get to the DEFCON levels. And when Bay of Pigs was happening, it got real close. Like they were starting the engines and everything. So it's interesting how all of that kind of panned out because I always wondered what his life would have been like if he would have actually gone there. And I mean, because I think for anybody that was in active combat in Vietnam, it just irrevocably changed every level of course in your life.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And it's interesting, actually. My son just interviewed my dad maybe 2 weeks ago now about it, about the experience. And it was actually fascinating because I think all this time I thought of it as like this really bad thing that he went through and the trauma and all of that. And of course, that is true. And what he actually said, because my son, one of the questions he asked was, would you do it again if you had a choice?
Yeah.
And he said, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He said,
Wow.
first of all, I felt good about fighting for my country. Second of all, I was a medic, so I was kind of like the man in my
Okay.
camp. He's like, I had my own car because I had like an ambulance, and I was the only medic. So everybody kind of had to, kind of needed favor with me. So he was like, so that part wasn't all bad. And
Yeah.
then thirdly, he was married when he went over there, and that broke up his first marriage. And so he said to my son, you wouldn't be here if I hadn't gone
Yeah.
over potentially.
Yeah.
Then I
That's
came back
interesting.
to Grandma, and yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. That is a good thing about, capturing those stories. It's good that he did that because sometimes they just don't get out there. So that
Yeah.
needed the proper light for sure. And I think the brotherhood too. I talked to a guy years ago. I used to work at a YMCA and he was living there. His name was Mikey, and he used to talk to me about, the weather was beautiful. I mean, there was a lot of things that he brought up that was a part of being in a communal environment of people that were doing the same thing. And I don't know that a lot of them understood the amount of protests that were going on at home until they got back.
That's what my father says. Yes. Yes,
So
exactly.
they were just
Mhm.
kind of in this, like all the greatest generation, all these other generations that just went over and that was a part of their duty. And I think a lot of these kids that were going to Vietnam were drafted, like there wasn't a choice, you
Right.
know.
Right.
Because I just
Yeah.
listened to the Muhammad Ali book about how he didn't go and how he actually got banned from boxing for 4 years and the stand he took and how much flack he took. And yeah, that was a crazy time for sure.
Yeah. 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 In fact, he also said in the story that they gave them civilian clothes to fly home in because they said it wouldn't be safe for them to fly home in their uniforms.
Yeah. Yeah.
Going on.
Oh, I remember that from Born on the 4th of July with Tom Cruise, how when he came home, he went to a parade, I think, and people were spitting and throwing things, and it was
Up,
crazy. So,
up. My dad said that people spit on him. Yeah, it was a thing. It
yeah, that's
definitely was.
wild. That's wild.
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
let me ask you this. Who's been a hero for you in your life? Kind of a consistent motivator for your work and for what you've done in your life?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I would say for sure my grandparents that I
Yeah.
mentioned before, I really looked up to them and their whole life was dedicated to service and helping others. They were in their 80s and they were still volunteering at the local food kitchen. And, they were always just had these very big, very giving hearts. And that's just how they led their lives. And they
Yeah.
had altogether, they had 6 kids, five natural and my aunt who was adopted. And there ended up being, I actually lost count at one point how many cousins because my one uncle keeps having kids.
Yeah.
But I think there's 18 of us at this point, and ranging from late 50s to one is still, I think, 6 years old. So we have this big family that kind of, reaches broad. And they really just taught us so much about the value of love and family and helping those that need help.
Yeah.
And it really has shaped everything I do and who I've become at this point. And that's sort of where I feel very fortunate because I feel like I get to do some amazing work every day that truly helps people. Work doesn't feel like work to me.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm trying to instill with my kids. I don't necessarily want them to, just get a job in a cubicle somewhere, some soul crushing job just to make money. I mean, obviously, money is important. And I'm not taking away from that either because I think there's a lot of, especially in social work, there's some like bashing of it's not okay to make money, but it's perfectly okay to make money, but
Yeah.
not at the expense of your soul. And so
Yeah.
find something that you really love to do that doesn't feel like work as much as possible and that you can just still enjoy your life
Yeah.
while having a vocation.
Yeah, for sure. So, of all of the people on the planet right now, if you could meet one person that you find fascinating and spend a little time with them, who would that be?
Peter Gabriel.
Ooh, nice.
He is I've had this on my bucket list forever. Yes, I
Wow.
think is an amazing, super brilliant and talented musician and artist, of course, and he's smart and he's funny and he's interesting, and he's done a lot of political active campaigns throughout the years that I've really been impressed by. So the one where I really took note of him and kind of fell in love with him was very involved from the ground up with a program called Witness, which nowadays to a lot of your listeners will seem like no big deal. But back then it was a
Mhm.
huge deal. So what they did was they provided video cameras, camcorders to third world countries where atrocities were happening, where these people would not have had access to video recording equipment. And so the stories of some of these atrocities weren't getting out because
Wow.
it would just be denied by the government. So they started getting videotaping equipment, and this is back, in the 80s when there was no smartphones or anything like that, into the hands of people in these situations so that it could get out to the media and to the larger world. No, this is actually what's going on here.
Yeah.
And it really saved a lot of lives. And I thought it was just such a fascinating um, mission and really wonderful. It was something so innovative that people
Yeah.
weren't. we're talking about. I was involved with Amnesty International in college, so we were doing a lot of letter writing campaigns, but to give people video equipment so that it's actually, yes, this is really what's happening there
Yeah.
is so powerful. I thought it was
The
really cool.
abs Yeah, absolutely it is. And he had so many different musical incarnations. I remember he did the soundtrack for The Last Temptation of Christ, which was pretty gripping, pretty hardcore. And that reminds me, I haven't listened to that in a while, but he did a lot of things like that that people probably don't realize. And I don't even know if a lot of people realize that he was the original guy in Genesis. It's
I
weird.
know. A lot of people don't
They
actually. I
don't.
kinda found
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. People kind of just think of In Your Eyes and that's all they
That's
know. And they
it.
don't know some of his
Yeah.
other work. And he also did an album. Well, I don't know if you remember, but he self-titled a lot of his albums. So it's kind of hard to, in the 80s to kind of distinguish between the two. But one of his albums, there were a lot of songs on there of political active
Yeah.
nature. And they were about, freeing political prisoners or what the experience must be like. He did a song dedicated to Stephen Biko, an activist in South Africa who was killed for his political activism. I mean, he just did some really cool things that
Yep.
I found super inspiring. And when you listen to those songs, they're just so moving. I mean, you
Yep.
really feel what that experience must be like to be a political prisoner when you
Yep.
hear, so that's, yeah, I would love to sit down and spend some time with him for sure.
Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, his big hit, Shock the Monkey, was about testing and all of that that was on animals, which at the time we didn't know. I mean,
Right.
being kids. So,
Right.
um, so let me ask you this. What is your motivation to do all of this work that you do to help people, but to also evolve as a human yourself? How do you do that?
Well, actually, that's where EFT tapping is just become such a gift in my life that I have learned this because I do see all my clients online, as I
Mhm.
said, and always have. And so I teach them to tap on their own acupressure points while we're processing some emotionally charged material.
Yeah.
And what that does is it sends a calming signal to the fight or flight and it shuts it off. And then it appears to rewire the brain. So you can create a new neural network around whatever it is you are trying to get rid of the emotion
Yeah.
behind. And it connects it to your frontal lobe, which is our logic, reason, judgment part of our brain. So you can remember the trauma or remember the phobia or something like that, but you don't have that fight or flight response anymore. You don't get the bug eyes and the tense and the
Yeah.
rapid. So it's really, really cool. And when I am doing it with clients online, I am actually tapping on my own acupressure points with them.
Yeah.
And so what I have found is that over time, I'm clearing out all this emotional gunk out of my clients' lives, but I'm also regulating my nervous system on the regular. And since in the 10 years since I first got trained, I'm like a completely different person. I'm way more chill. I'm way less reactive. Now I recognize my triggers early and I tap on them myself and I clear them and they don't become a thing. And so it's been really a fascinating journey to get to do this work and to see how well it works because previously I was a regular sort of traditional talk therapist. And I mean, I think therapy is great and it can be really helpful and you can have the insight, know exactly why, let's say, you're self sabotaging, and yet you can't seem to change it. And that was the
Yeah.
problem I kept finding with my clients over and over. They would get it, they would know why they were doing it, but they would continue to do this behavior. It's like we know we're not supposed to eat a whole sleeve of cookies, but we do it anyway, right?
Yeah. Right.
So EFT breaks that emotional connection to the reason why you're doing that.
Gotcha.
So usually like some kind of subconscious program that's going on, right? It's like we're eating the cookies because we're feeling sad and that makes us feel happy, right?
Yeah.
The sugar
Yeah.
rush. So that
Yeah.
so whatever the subconscious piece to it is, we can tap on that, we can clear it, and then you suddenly change and it's easy to change. It's sort of effortless to change your behavior after you've tapped on it. And that's what is really cool to see
Yeah.
over and over. Mhm.
It's interesting how you can retrain your brain. I'm listening to a book now called Moonwalking with Einstein. I'm interviewed a memory champ And he was referencing this book being one of the reasons why he actually kind of turned a corner and got into it. And it's interesting how the brain, how memories are stored and how all of it can be rerouted and how you can train yourself. And the author basically became a memory champ too and was like, I don't want to like burst anybody's bubble, but these people aren't like super human. You can do this. Anybody can do it. And it's interesting how you can like reroute how, and if, when you understand how your brain works and where things go, and it's fascinating. All of that's very fascinating.
Yeah, and just the whole concept of neuroplasticity is
Yeah.
relatively new, I think, especially to like lay people or the general public. When I was growing up in the 80s, it was very much like, oh, our brain is fixed and it can't change. And
Right.
that's completely disproven. And
Right.
we know now that that's not true at all. And but some people still think it is, and some
Yeah.
people don't realize how much power we do have to change our
Yeah.
brains.
For
Mhm.
sure. I'm curious. So you're helping your clients, but at the end of the day, what's the best advice that you've ever gotten?
Ooh, what is the best advice that I have ever gotten? That is an interesting question. Hmm. I think simply the concept that I'm trying to remember when I would have first been exposed to this, maybe through some Deepak Chopra books. It basically the concept that our subconscious does control a lot of our conscious activity.
Yeah.
And if you are not aware of what's going on back there, then you will be driven by it and you will feel a victim to it. And actually, I do know one quote that stuck out to me very clearly was from Eckhart Tolle's book. I don't remember which one of his books because I've read most of them, but it might have been The Power of Now. And it was actually in the foreword, and he was talking about the time in his life when he was feeling suicidal. I believe it was a very young man, early 20s, late teens, and he said, "I had the thought in my head that I can't live with myself anymore." And then he stopped, and the next thought that dropped in was, "Wait a minute. Who is me and who is myself? Or who is I and who is myself? I can't live with myself." And he said it was the first time it just really rocked him to realize, wait a minute, there is me and there is consciousness in
Yeah.
me. And just I talk about this concept with my clients a lot now, like putting like a little crowbar. Like when you start to get that crowbar between, I am not actually my thoughts. Your thoughts are going 60, 70,000 thoughts a day. And we come to believe them and we come to be driven by them. And most of our thoughts are formed in the first 6 to 7 years of our lives. We are operating in a theta brainwave state. Theta brainwave is the state right before sleep or right when you're coming out of sleep, that woozy sort of dreamlike feeling. And so any information that you're exposed to in the first 6 to 7 years just gets embedded right into your subconscious without any filter.
Yeah.
And so you then are driven by these things. If something bad happened to you when your grandma was cooking chicken soup, the smell of chicken soup might upset you and you have no idea why. So we can have these triggers that are going, but when you start to get that crowbar in and realize, okay, wait a minute, this reaction I'm having right now is not me, or this
Yeah.
thought I'm having right now is not me.
Yep.
It's just a thought. I can change a thought. It's just a reaction. I can change a reaction. Then you start to have control over your life and you move from victim to, in control of your own destiny. And that is a really powerful change when people can get there.
And what's ironic about that is that all of those early formative memories we don't even remember.
Right.
You
Right.
know what I'm
Exactly.
saying? So then we spend the rest of our lives remembering something we never remembered to begin with. It wasn't malleable enough to
Right.
be, so it is weird. And it's kind of that whole idea of dream time, all of those things that we dream about are totally a part of our timeline. And it,
Right.
and
Right.
anyway, that can be a whole other rabbit hole, you know?
Well, and that's why I'm super excited about the move in my field in psychology towards more mind body
Yeah,
kinds of interventions, because traditional therapy was reliant on verbal processing. And if
yeah,
you don't have a verbal memory of something, you cannot possibly process it verbally to get rid of it.
yeah.
But some of the techniques like EMDR, it's eye movement
Huh?
desensitization reprocessing, EFT tapping, some of these other somatic work, some of these other really exciting fields that are, sort of busting out right now in psychology are able to heal people at such a much more significant level. I've had so many clients say, "Wow, I worked on that for 7 years in therapy. You just cleared it in 4 sessions." I mean,
Yeah,
it's wild, but it's because of this. It's because we are sort of combating nonverbal with nonverbal,
yeah,
and that is what is actually doing the trick for people.
yeah. So of all of these things that you've done as a professional and all of these ways that you've evolved in your life, what are you the proudest of?
I would say my book at this point is my sort of career pinnacle. So I had the idea for my book for many years. So what happened in my life is I went through a divorce in my early 40s. Of
Mhm.
course, most of us don't expect to go through a divorce, and I definitely did not. So I sort of suddenly found myself in this whole new world, being single again at midlife, really
Mhm.
thrown, never imagining I'd be dating again and out there dating. And as I started experiencing that new chapter of life, I met a lot of single women. We became good friends. We were sort of going through this experience together. But what I realized is I had a lot of tools and sort of tricks, if you will, that they didn't as a therapist. I knew how to validate people, how to speak to people using I statements, just a lot of things that are really helpful for relationships and dating and things like that. And so I had this idea, and of course, I had EFT tapping, and I knew that EFT tapping could help you when you're bummed out about being ghosted or when you are nervous for a first date or things like that. So I thought to myself, I should write a book on all this knowledge in my head. I have all this neuroscience knowledge, all this stuff. I wrote a lot about what we just talked about with memory and coding and all of that in my book. But I thought about it. I knew I wanted to write it. I knew I had that title, Date Like a Goddess, was like what I wanted it to be because I wanted it to be an empowerment guide for single women. And I didn't write it. And I didn't write it. And I didn't write it. And the pandemic hit. And my friend said to me, "Now you can write your book. You have
Yeah,
all the time." And I was like, "Yeah, good point. I'll write my book." And I didn't write it. I wrote an
yeah,
outline in June of 2020, and that was about it. So what ended up happening for me was when I was 48, I work with a EFT tapping practitioner myself on bigger issues because sometimes we need someone else to
yeah,
see things from the outside. And I went to him and I said, "I'm starting to feel anxious about turning 50 and I really don't know why." And he was like, "Well, let's tap and let's see." So what tapping will do is often clear sort of the emotional gunk, and then insight drops in because
yeah,
now the blood is flowing to your frontal lobe where our good decisions come from. And what I realized in that process was I was feeling anxious because I knew I wanted to write a book. Everyone always told me you should write a book. I'm a storyteller. And I was afraid somehow that if I didn't write it before 50, I was going to sort of die with this book in me.
yeah,
And I was afraid of writing the book because it's very public. It makes, you become very seen.
yeah,
I knew I wanted to write a really vulnerable book because those are the kinds of books I like to read. I
mhm,
knew I wanted to include a lot of personal stories. I had 2 teenage boys. I thought, "Oh, how is this going to affect them writing about my dating life in such a public way?" and things like that. But once I tapped on it and I cleared all of that, what actually came out was this incredible book that I've gotten a lot of positive feedback, and I feel like it's really helpful for single women, especially dating at midlife with all of your insecurities and fears and worries of having to start over. And every chapter has a tapping script, so you have this amazing tool to learn of EFT tapping to help clear some of that stuff just from
yeah.
reading the book.
So if anyone wants to get the book, they want to reach out to you, they want to hire you, any of the good business, where can they go?
Well, my book is on Amazon. It's called Find Love Again, Learn to Date Like a Goddess. And they can find me at inspiredlifetapping.com or on all the socials. I'm at Inspired Life Tapping.
Excellent. Allison, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your story. Best of luck with the book and everything else. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you.